Welcome to today's episode, where we explore something that impacts every one of us, decision-making. Joining us is Dr. Kim, a cognitive psychologist who specializes in decision-making processes. Dr. Kim, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to discuss this fascinating topic with you.
Let's start with the basics. We make hundreds of decisions daily, from trivial things like what to eat to life-changing ones, like career moves. But why are some decisions so much harder than others?
That's a great question. Essentially, it boils down to the complexity and stakes of the decision. Simple decisions like choosing what to have for lunch involve fewer variables and consequences. Bigger decisions, however, like career changes, have long-term implications, uncertainty, and emotional factors that make the process much more daunting.
So, would you say that our emotions often cloud our judgment in these big moments?
Absolutely. Emotions play a huge role, especially when the stakes are high. Research shows that when we're emotionally charged, it's easy to make impulsive choices that we might later regret. That's why one of the keys to making wiser decisions is learning to step back and distance ourselves from immediate emotional reactions.
That makes a lot of sense. But then, how do we balance emotions and logic when making important choices?
It's all about finding a balance. Emotions are important. They tell us what matters to us, but relying solely on them can lead to rash decisions. On the other hand, being overly logical and ignoring emotions can leave us disconnected from what we truly want. One strategy is to recognize the emotional factors but not let them dominate. Take time to reflect, then analyze the situation logically.
I love that. So, Dr. Kim, would you say that the process of decision-making is a skill we can improve?
Definitely. The more aware we are of our thought processes and biases, the better we become at making decisions. It's a skill we can develop through practice, reflection, and by learning to consider multiple perspectives.
All right, let's dig into the psychology behind decision-making. Dr. Kim, we've all heard about making choices using intuition versus logic, but how does that actually work in our brains?
It's a fascinating process. Essentially, we have two systems that guide our decisions. The first system is fast and intuitive, often called the gut feeling. It helps us make quick decisions based on past experiences and instinct. The second system is slower, more deliberate, and logical. It takes into account reason and critical thinking. Together, they form the basis of how we approach decisions.
So, would you say we should always aim to be more logical in our decision-making?
Not necessarily. Both systems have their strengths. Intuition can be incredibly useful when we're familiar with a situation or need to make decisions quickly. But for more complex decisions where the stakes are higher, it's better to engage the more logical system and carefully weigh your options.
Interesting. And speaking of high-stakes decisions, we've heard about the paradox of choice. How does having too many options affect our ability to make decisions?
Yes, the paradox of choice. While it might seem like having more options would lead to better decisions, it can actually overwhelm us. When we have too many choices, we can get stuck in analysis paralysis, constantly second-guessing ourselves, which ultimately makes us less satisfied with our final decision.
That's so true. I've definitely spent way too much time deciding what to watch on streaming platforms. So, how can we avoid getting stuck in that paralysis?
One effective method is to limit your options from the start. Set criteria for what you're looking for and narrow it down to just a few choices. And sometimes it's important to recognize when a decision isn't life-changing. Don't sweat the small stuff.
Now that we've explored the psychology behind decision-making, let's talk about how we can actually make better choices. Dr. Kim, what are some concrete steps we can take to make wiser decisions?
The first step is to get clear on your goals. What do you want to achieve with this decision? Whether it's personal or professional, knowing your end goal will guide the entire process.
That sounds simple but often overlooked. What's next once we've clarified our goals?
The second step is to pause before making any decisions. It's important to give yourself time to reflect and avoid emotional decision-making. When you're feeling pressured or emotionally charged, you're more likely to make impulsive choices that you might regret later. Stepping back allows you to think things through logically.
That's great advice. So, after taking that pause, what comes next?
The third step is to widen your mental spotlight. Instead of focusing only on one option, try to generate multiple alternatives. This helps to break away from narrow thinking and allows you to see all your options clearly.
I like that, keeping our minds open to more possibilities. Any final tips?
Lastly, consider the consequences of each option. Think about both the short-term and long-term outcomes and weigh the pros and cons carefully. This reflection will help you make a choice that aligns with your goals and values.
Those steps sound like a solid foundation for making better decisions. Thanks for breaking it down so clearly, Dr. Kim. Now, Dr. Kim, let's talk about something that often makes decision-making difficult: uncertainty. How can we deal with the fear of the unknown when making decisions?
Uncertainty is a huge challenge in decision-making. It's natural to feel uncomfortable when we don't know what the future holds, but it's important to remember that uncertainty is a part of life. The key is to learn to manage it rather than avoid it.
So, how do we begin to manage that fear of uncertainty? It can be overwhelming for a lot of people.
One way is to accept that you'll never have all the information. Rather than waiting for the perfect moment or absolute certainty, make peace with the fact that you'll need to act despite not knowing everything. It's about making the best decision with the information you do have.
That makes sense. We can't wait forever for all the answers to show up. What else can we do?
Another strategy is to focus on what you can control. There will always be external factors beyond your influence, but you can control how you respond to them and how prepared you are. When you shift your focus to the aspects within your control, you reduce the anxiety that comes with uncertainty.
That's a great point. By shifting our focus, we can feel more empowered. But what about when we're afraid of making the wrong choice?
That's where reframing failure comes in. Instead of seeing a wrong choice as a failure, view it as a learning opportunity. Every decision, even if it doesn't turn out as expected, teaches us something valuable. With that mindset, the fear of making mistakes starts to diminish.
I love that perspective. It really takes the pressure off. Thanks again, Dr. Kim, for sharing these insights. I'm sure our listeners will find these tips super helpful when dealing with uncertainty in their own decision-making. Let's move on to a deeper aspect of decision-making: ethical and moral choices. Dr. Kim, these kinds of decisions can be incredibly complex. How do we approach them?
Ethical and moral decisions are indeed complex because they're not just about personal preferences, they involve principles and values that affect others. The first step in navigating these decisions is understanding your own moral framework. This could come from cultural, religious, or personal beliefs, and knowing where you stand helps guide your choices.
So, it's about knowing what we value. But what happens when those values conflict? How do we resolve that?
That's where ethical dilemmas come in when two or more values are in conflict. In these situations, it's important to weigh the consequences of each option. Think about the impact on yourself and others, and consider which choice aligns most closely with your core values. Sometimes it's about choosing the option that does the least harm.
That sounds difficult. Is there a specific framework we can use to help guide us in making these tough decisions?
One well-known approach is the utilitarian framework, which focuses on choosing the action that results in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. There's also the deontological approach, which emphasizes sticking to certain ethical principles, regardless of the outcome. Both have their merits, and sometimes a balance between them is needed.
It sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a thoughtful process. What advice do you have for people struggling with these kinds of decisions?
The key is to be as informed as possible. Gather as much relevant information as you can, talk to people who may be impacted, and reflect on the possible consequences. Also, don't be afraid to seek guidance from trusted mentors or colleagues, as they can offer valuable perspectives. Ultimately, the goal is to make a decision that you can stand by with integrity.
That's really helpful advice. Ethical decisions might be tough, but with a process like that, we can make choices that align with our values and principles. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for shedding light on this important topic. We've covered a lot about decision-making today, but let's talk about some common pitfalls that people tend to fall into. Dr. Kim, what are some of the most frequent mistakes people make when trying to decide?
There are several pitfalls that can trip us up. One of the biggest is confirmation bias. This happens when we only seek out information that supports what we already believe and ignore evidence that contradicts it. It leads to poor decision-making because we're not seeing the full picture.
That's a really common one. It's so easy to fall into that trap without even realizing it. What can we do to avoid it?
The key is to actively seek out information that challenges your assumptions. Ask yourself, what am I missing? Is there evidence that contradicts my initial thoughts? By considering alternative perspectives, you make more balanced decisions.
Great advice. Are there other common mistakes we should watch out for?
Absolutely. Another big one is analysis paralysis. This happens when we overthink and get stuck in indecision because we have too many options or are afraid of making the wrong choice. The solution here is to set a time limit for making your decision and remind yourself that not all decisions are irreversible.
I've definitely experienced that. Anything else we should be mindful of?
Another common pitfall is emotional decision-making. When emotions are running high, we tend to make impulsive choices. To overcome this, it's helpful to pause and let the emotion settle before making any major decisions. This gives you a clearer perspective.
So true. It's all about giving yourself that space to think. Any last words of wisdom on avoiding these pitfalls?
The final tip is to learn from your past decisions. Reflect on what worked well and what didn't. By understanding your own tendencies, you can improve your decision-making process over time.
Such a valuable insight. Self-reflection is key. Thank you again, Dr. Kim, for helping us navigate the common pitfalls of decision-making. We've covered a lot today, from the psychology of decision-making to avoiding common pitfalls. Dr. Kim, as we wrap up, what's your final piece of advice for our listeners?
The most important thing is to trust the process. Decision-making is a skill that improves with practice, reflection, and patience. It's okay to make mistakes or face uncertainty. The key is to learn from every choice and trust that with time, you'll get better at making decisions that align with your values and goals.
That's such a powerful reminder. Trust the process and embrace the learning journey. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kim, and for sharing your expertise with our audience.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you found value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. If you liked what you heard, please hit that like button and leave a comment below to share your thoughts or any decision-making tips you have. We'd love to hear from you.